Tinsen. Okay, so we've established in the previous video that Daoism is primarily, fundamentally at its core, an oral tradition, and has historically always been an oral tradition, with transmissions being passed down through master, disciple, and teacher and student relationships. Now this raises an interesting question, because if it's primarily an oral tradition, then, what gives with all the books? Glad you asked. Firstly, we want to make a distinction between books about Daoism, of which there's an innumerable quantity, and actual Taoist texts. Now, the actual Taoist texts are part of what we'd call the Taoist canon, the Daoism. And that's what we're talking about here. We're not talking about, the Tao of making money, or the Tao of poo even, or the of piglet, or the, Tao Te Ching for single mothers, or whatever is all out there. That stuff is all fine, but that's not really what we're getting at here. Those aren't considered Taoist texts. We're talking about the Daoism. Okay, the first iteration of the Daoism, or the Taoist canon, was compiled right around the year 400 CE, so about 1800 years ago. And over time, it has gone through many changes. The current version has around 1,400, maybe closer to 1,500 texts. That's not counting the who knows how many texts that were burned by the government and otherwise lost throughout the millennia. Okay, for a bit of perspective, fewer than 10% of that approximate 1,400 have actually been translated into English. So that's a lot. That's a lot of books, especially for an oral tradition. So why do we have so many? Well, the original Daoism was broken up into three main areas, or caves, caverns. Caves, caverns, grottos. That's very symbolic in Daoism. There are many reasons for it. That's a very common theme. It's often used as a descriptor for like levels of a thing, or places where something is put. I don't know if that makes much sense. So instead of saying three levels here, we have three caverns, or three grottos, three caves. Okay, three primary categories, all right, which originally were exorcism, ritual, and meditation. These also mirrored the three levels of development, or gong, we could say, skill, for Taoists in that time period in China. And the version of the Daoism we have today still adheres to those three caves, albeit somewhat loosely, again, because of the various changes throughout history that have been made. But we're still dealing with three main categories here. Now, each of these categories then are broken down into further sort of subcategories, focusing on various elements and aspects of a Taoist practice. So this is really the crux of it. There are so many texts, because there are so many Taoists and so many different ways of walking the way, of practicing Taoism. Essentially, the texts are supplemental. Okay? You have to have a practice, and the oral tradition and the system of transmission from master to disciple, or teacher to student, is primary. But the text tradition is really sort of there to support each of those different areas. Now, having said that, one's practice can be, and often is, steeped in teachings from a text, all right? But the text doesn't necessarily define the practice. I don't know if that makes sense if I say it that way. Hopefully you know what I mean. For example, if you are a cultivator and you're practicing Nedan, or inner alchemy, you'll find within, say, the Kantong Chi, or the Secret of the Golden Flower, or any of these various alchemical texts, methods and guidance observations, reflections, and so on about inner alchemy practice. And again, some of them, like The Secret of the Golden Flower, outline and map out this process in written form. But without a qualified teacher, you're not going to have any idea what any of that stuff means. And you see this all the time, too, if you just go to Amazon and look at some of the reviews on some of these texts, and you'll see things like, what the hell is this? You can't meditate to this. Or, this is just gibberish. It's all double talk and such. Well, right. Because you're not meant to meditate to it, and it's supposed to look like gibberish. Because these things are written, number one, in what we today call classical Chinese, for the most part, which is a long dead language. And number two, they've been translated then into English, oftentimes from another Latin-based or Germanic-based language. And number three, they were never designed to be read by the average person in the first place. They're using symbolic, alchemical coded language. So no, things don't always mean what they mean. They almost never do in many of these core Taoist texts, particularly the ones that are focusing on alchemy. So without that oral tradition and without a qualified teacher to guide you, that's really not going to do you a whole lot of good. But if you have that and you already have a practice, then these texts can be supplemental. And sometimes you might run into areas where what's outlined in the text differs quite greatly from what you've experienced in your own practice. You go with what you've experienced in your own practice or what your teacher recommends, typically, because your experience is yours and not that of whoever is attributed with having written the text. But they're very important. And textual study is very important in Taoism too. That at some level, that's inescapable, particularly if you're talking like the priest, monk, nun level. Scriptural study is absolutely a thing. But it is secondary to the thrust of your practice. You can make your practice focused around the texts. That's fine. That's perfectly legitimate. But you still have to do something. You can't get there just by reading a book. Okay? So, again, they are important, but they're primarily there as a supplement. You can look at whatever area of Daoism is particularly important to you and start there. Or if you're part of a lineage, different lineages, sects, and schools may have particular texts and practices that are points of focus for them. If you practice medicine, for example, the Huangdi Neijing, the Yellow Emperor's Classic of Internal Medicine, that might be very central to your Taoist practice. If you don't, then that's fine. You might not care about it at all. It is still a legitimate Taoist text and is part of the canon. Okay? If you're more philosophically minded, you might look to the Litzi or the Shuangzi or something like that. Those may be more central to your Taoist practice, but they don't have to be. The Tao Te Ching is not the Taoist Bible, as is often mentioned and talked about on the internet and things. Yes, this is the Taoist Bible. No, it isn't. It is a very important text, but it is just one text. It is one of the many, 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 many lanterns that light the same road. If you're going to talk about a Taoist Bible, then that would be the Daoism, the canon itself, with all of its various books. If you look at the Christian Bible, for example, you have all the Gospels, the Psalms, so on, all these various books that make up the thing. It's the same kind of idea here. So that is, in a nutshell, the main reason why you have so many texts in a primarily oral tradition. Okay? I hope that helps if you did have that question, and if you didn't, I hope that you still learned something useful. And I want to thank you, and we'll see you next time. Dao on.